Please join me in welcoming Dr Eleanor Longden, Postdoctoral Research Fellow, the University of Liverpool, Coordinator, Intervoice, Scientific Community, and international speaker who is invited around the world to share her experiences and her research, the last of which was at Yale University Medical School. I've very much shortened her biography so that she'll have plenty of time to talk with you. Please welcome Dr. Longden.
Right, outstanding. I've managed to get on the stage without falling on my face, so I feel like things can only go uphill from here. And I have my papers, so it's all good. Thank you so much for that wonderful welcome, Liz, and thank you so much to all of you guys. It's fantastic to see so many people here this evening. Okay, so the subject for our lecture, mental illness recovery, is it possible? Spoilers, yes. But of course, as we know, it's not quite as simple as that. And to discuss some of the reasons why I think it's not quite as simple as that, I want to begin this presentation with an optical illusion. And I think an image like this is extremely interesting because it demonstrates a very particular type of blindness. Now, a significant majority of people, when they see an image like this for the very first time, see either a young girl or an old woman. But they struggle to see both until it's pointed out to them. It's as if it was there all along and we just didn't recognize it. And once we know, it seems so obvious. Now, one of the premises of this talk and its implications for recovery is that, from my perspective, a similar lack of recognition applies to overwhelming distress. It's as if, on one hand, we see someone who hears voices, someone who has unusual beliefs, someone who self-injures, and we recognize that these experiences are calling our attention to the existence of some kind of pain, some kind of unspeakable secret, and yet simultaneously it's deflecting our attention away from that. So on one hand, we see someone in pain, someone in need, someone with a story to tell, and yet simultaneously it's as if we can't recognize any of those things, and all we see are signs and symptoms of disease, of disability, of mental illness. Now, this process mirrors the concept of doublethink, is something that I'm going to suggest to you. And doublethink was coined by the author George Orwell in his dystopian novel 1984. And what doublethink refers to is basically the expectation to simultaneously hold mutually contradictory beliefs. Doublethink, in this respect, is a form of denial, it's a form of repression, it's a form of hypocrisy, and unfortunately, it's a form of thinking that saturates society, the media, the political classes, and, unfortunately, aspects of the mental health system. Because it's a form of thinking that argues that people's anguish is principally biological in origin, and a form of thinking that minimizes the impact of distressing life events, either as irrelevant or dismisses them as the role of a catalyst for some kind of underlying genetic disease process. And this is problematic, and it has huge implications for recovery because it leads to what the British psychologist Dr. Lucy Johnston conceptualizes as extremely mixed messages about personal responsibility. So on one hand, we're being told you have a medical illness with primarily biological causes, versus your problems are a meaningful and understandable response to your life circumstances. So you have an illness, which is not your fault, but you retain responsibility for it and must make an effort to get better. But you must do it our way, because we are the experts in your illness. And this can be very, very difficult for very, very many people, and it leads to the familiar contradictions of everyday psychiatric practice, which are contradictions that are almost inevitable when you combine two models that have fundamentally incompatible core assumptions. So we have this concept of being non-compliant because we weren't engaged in services, or we comply too much and we become too dependent. We won't accept our illness, so we demonstrate a lack of insight, or we accept our illness too much and start to demonstrate sick role behaviour. We're too demanding of services, or we don't demand enough, and suddenly we're not engaging with services. Again, doublethink, contradiction that comes from looking at these experiences in such fundamentally incompatible ways. And this is very, very important because it leads to the question, and one of the questions for our uncomfortable conversations that I'm going to be raising this evening is the idea of recovery from what? And the emphasis of this presentation is going to be on psychosis or schizophrenia, partly because that's what my research background is in, but also because schizophrenia is the chimera of recovery. It's a diagnosis, probably more than any other, that is seeped and saturated in the language of pessimism and pathology. And in order to start deconstructing this and to try and break and resist the demands of doublethink, we need to begin by acknowledging the substantial research, this recent meta-analysis being just one of many, many, many examples that links life conflicts and difficulties in a very powerful and consistent way with the incidence of complex mental health problems. In turn, we also need to acknowledge the overwhelming similarities, at least in some cases, between the neurological abnormalities that are evident in psychosis, the so-called disease model of schizophrenia, and the impact of trauma and stress on the brain. Something like this is a far more genuinely integrated biopsychosocial model. Again, a technique for dismantling doublethink that doesn't see these changes as the result of a carnivorous disease process, but rather as an intelligible, understandable, and reversible response to the impact of environmental stressors. And again, this is very, very important because research in the last decade is demonstrating beyond reasonable doubt that the experiences that get labelled as psychosis and as schizophrenia are powerfully and robustly associated with a broad range of overwhelming adversarial life events. And this means that as members of society, as workers in mental health services, as friends, family members, as citizens, we have a moral responsibility to engage with the impact of distress, to bear witness to suffering, to engage with the experiences of loss, stress, despair, abuse, and disempowerment that have shaped the lives of people who use mental health services. Now, because of the absolutely enormous size of this literature and the considerable time constraints of this presentation, this unfortunately is not something I can cover in considerable detail, but I would warmly recommend this book for a very comprehensive, up-to-date and accessible summary. But a very irresistible conclusion of this type of research that's appearing at a monumental rate is that we absolutely need to stop decontextualizing human misery. We need to stop denying and minimizing the impact of distressing life events, and we need to stop sanitizing distress into abstract clusters of syndromes and symptoms and disorders. Mental health care and consequently recovery should be about far more than just viewing people as technological problems that require fixing and modifying through diagnosis and medication. Rather, it should be about compassion, connection, relatedness, not us and them, but we. Because certainly, from my perspective, the medicalisation and pathologization of human distress is one of the greatest errors and human rights abuses of recent times. And the stigmatization, coercion, and silencing of people who experience overwhelming distress has no place in an enlightened society. It absolutely belongs in a museum. And let us hope that eventually that is where it's going to end up. Or as Professor Loran Moshe has said, founder of the Soteria movement and professor of psychiatry, when considering the evidence for the impact of overwhelming life events in psychosis, the research is a straightforward, unashamed wake-up call. Everyone involved should act in whatever way your circumstances allow to end this madness. Now, I believe this from my clinical experience and from my research experience, and I believe it from my personal experience, because I was one of those children. My life is essentially a story in several acts of trauma, degradation, madness, and redemption. And a full version is freely available online at TED.com, but suffice to say, it was a story of endurance and survival, of sustained, organised and sadistic sexual abuse, of physical violence, of emotional harm, and of a shattered child who would grow up to be a crushed and devastated adult, only to discover at the age of 18 that the cycle of victimisation would begin all over again. By the age of 19, I was well on my way to being consigned to the schizophrenia scrap heap. I'd been diagnosed, drugged and discarded, and told by one psychiatrist, Eleanor, you'd be better off with cancer because cancer is easier to cure than schizophrenia. I, by now, had the whole frenzied repertoire, grotesque visions, bizarre, intractable delusions, voices so terrifying that I tried to drill a hole in my head in order to get them out. And possibly, worst of all, a toxic, tormenting sense of hopelessness, humiliation, and despair about myself and my prospects. And without a doubt, one of the things that saved me was encountering the international Hearing Voices movement and the work of Professor Marius Romm and Dr. Sonja Escher, which inspired it, which locates voice hearing and other unusual experiences as survival strategies, as sane reactions to insane circumstances, not aberrant symptoms of illness to be endured, but complex, significant, and meaningful experiences to be explored. In mental health, there are organisations that are perceived as great medical organisations or great therapy organisations or organisations that excel in research. But to me, the Hearing Voices movement is a great humanitarian organisation, and it reaches out across the world. I first encountered this framework as a traumatised, demoralised patient, and through it discovered aspirations that transcended notions of damage, deficit, and diagnosis, but instead outlined a framework where personally defined recovery was deemed not only just possible, but inevitable and available for every single person. And this is a conceptualization of recovery that I want to emphasize on this talk because it's based on a framework that doesn't ask what's wrong with you, but rather what's happened to you. An important emphasis in Intervoice is to support distressed individuals, to make sense of what's happening to them, to listen to their stories, to explore what their beliefs mean to them, and to offer input in working towards healing. Everyone is credited with unique insight, wisdom, and expertise about the nature of their own experiences. No one is told their beliefs are wrong, no one is turned away, no one is believed to be too ill to benefit. We do, of course, recognise how distressing and demoralising voice hearing can be, but we do also see it as a significant, meaningful experience that can be explored, interpreted and understood, an opportunity for learning and growth, even if those lessons are extremely painful and difficult, rather than just a pathological symptom devoid of context. And for me, I think the achievements of the Hearing Voices movement are a reminder that empathy, fellowship, justice, respect are more than words. They are convictions and beliefs, and that beliefs really can change the world. In the last 20 years, the movement has established Hearing Voices networks in 26 countries across 5 continents, working together to promote dignity, empowerment and solidarity for individuals in mental distress, to create a new language and practice of hope. At its very centre lies an unshakable belief in the power and resilience of the individual. And very importantly, this is a framework that's just as applicable to statutory services, because by incorporating more cooperative, humanistic and meaning-making elements into therapeutic work, we can support individuals to move beyond surviving the past and help them create a rewarding future. The idea that a productive, peaceful, positive life, irrespective of a painful present or a harrowing past, is a fundamental right of everyone who uses mental health services. Now, the difficulty, of course, having referred to doublethink, is that the way people's distress is often responded to can actually be a major hindrance for that process of healing. This is a concept that's neatly summarised in the following model, and it's certainly one that I relate to and one that I think is true for many people. Not everyone, of course, but for many of us. It's the idea that the nature of the crisis, a supposed biogenetic abnormality, It's responded to with denial, in the sense that the emotional meaning, symbolism, and relevance of our so-called symptoms is minimized, and the role of painful life events is denied. Insight is defined as accepting the reality of our brain disease, of our mental illness. Recovery is conceptualized just as controlling symptoms, and often that's done with medication and nothing else. And subsequently, the risk of relapse runs high because underlying social and emotional problems have not been resolved. And this, plus stigma, exclusion, helplessness, hopelessness, means that the original crisis is more likely to reoccur. Fundamentally, this is a framework that theorizes and responds to distress using the terminology, disorder, symptom, pathology, and practice, diagnosis, medication of bodily disease. And I think this is potentially very, very problematic, because then rather are seen as socially and emotionally intelligible responses to adversity, our experiences, our sensible and sane reactions to what's happened to us are reconfigured as the sign of a brain abnormality, medical problems necessitating medical solutions. And the real risk of this, of course, in some cases, is that this can risk blinding us to the painful social and emotional realities of people's lives. On the contrary, I think for many of us, understanding, accepting, and integrating the emotional meaning of our experiences is the recovery response. And this requires, and again, I've seen this so often in both personal and professional experience, a rediscovery of the past. Because for many of us, we need to understand the past in order to reclaim the present and the future. And this is the idea of having the opportunity to fully explore and acknowledge the subjective meaning of our experiences, whatever that may be, and using this wisdom to inform and guide genuine healing and genuine growth. Now, I referred earlier to the concept of doublethink, and I want to briefly give one example of a method from the Hearing Voices movement that can be used to challenge this way of thinking. It's the method of psychological formulation called the construct, and it was devised by Marius Romm and Sondra Escher as an open and systematic way to try and explore and decode the links between voice content, voice characteristics, and experienced adversity in the life of the voice hearer. Fundamentally, what an approach, and the many, many similar approaches that exist that are out there, are about is deconstructing our experiences as generic symptoms and reconstructing them as meaningful experiences that have occurred in a specific and individual context. And for the purposes of recovery, the benefit of working in this way is that we can find ways to cope not only with the voices or other experiences themselves, but also the underlying life events and painful emotions that may well be implicated in the onset and maintenance of our experiences. To devise a construct, we would examine these 5 key themes, all of which are premised on the idea that voice characteristics are personally significant to the voice hearer and related to aspects of their life history. And then use this unique information to answer 2 fundamental questions about representation. First of all, who or what might the voices represent? The idea that voice hearing can often be related to significant individuals in a person's life in either a literal or a metaphorical way. And secondly, what problems might the voices represent? A question that goes to the circumstances at the heart of the voice hearing experience, which again, for many of us, is events, problems, and situations that were so overwhelming they exceeded the ability to cope. And in turn, of course, we then use this information to inform a recovery plan, not a treatment plan, but one that's premised on classic 3-stage models of healing of the type purported by the trauma theorist Judith Herman and many others, that's basically premised on finding safe passage through our distress. How can we balance the need to preserve safety against the need to face and process pain? And a recovery plan might look something like this. First of all, the notion of establishing safety, helping people to find ways to feel safe, to feel protected, to establish a sense of control and power, to tolerate and mitigate distress in the mind, in the body, in the surrounding environment. Moving on to be able to make sense of one's experiences, to approach so-called symptoms with greater compassion, empathy, tolerance, sensitivity, to use them as clues to internal emotional conflicts that can be understood and channeled in new ways. And finally, turning our attention just not only from getting rid of suffering, but to moving towards the future. Goals, hopes, plans, aspirations, again, to move beyond surviving the past and to create a rewarding future. And in terms of the construct itself, we recently decided to see how applicable is this method. And what we found is that actually in the vast majority of cases, it is perfectly possible to engage in an exploration of vulnerabilities and adversities with people who hear voices. And this includes samples who have been diagnosed with schizophrenia and who have been in mental health services for a very, very long time, the so-called chronic schizophrenia sample. Of course, this research has limitations, just as any research does, but what it does suggest that in many, many cases, what we can find is that these are psychological and emotionally significant experiences that relate to people's unique biographies in very powerful and compelling ways. And in the vast majority of cases, these were lived narratives that had been obscured behind the schizophrenia label, behind the patient role, and behind the pessimistic implications of a disease model of voice hearing. Likewise, research with 50 recovered voice hearers, also often diagnosed with schizophrenia, has really reiterated the importance of holistic, person-centered principles in trying to regain control over both one's voices and one's life. An abridged version of recurring recovery themes was the following: people that show interest in you as a person, not just as a patient. Hope, optimism, having voice hearing normalized rather than catastrophized. Active education and exploration around the voice hearing experience. Acknowledging voices as a personal experience and taking ownership of them. Making constructive changes in the relationship with your voices. And recognizing and accepting your emotions. And in turn, this is an abridged example of what the same 50 people identified as hindering their respective journeys to healing. And given, of course, that this is a small sample, I think we do still need to ask ourselves some potentially uncomfortable questions about whether this is what we standardly provide people who come through the doors of our mental health services. Medication being offered as the only treatment option. The negative impact of medication on social functioning. Pessimistic, hopeless messages about chronic illness. Preoccupation with mental illness at the expense of social and emotional problems, lack of interest in the voices themselves or the life events and emotions that relate to them, ignoring cultural or spiritual experience, and stigma and rejection from being labelled mentally ill. Now, this is all very important because I think these two lists sort of really capture one of the other themes that I want to explore with you, which is this difference between personal recovery and clinical recovery. And the idea of personal recovery, I think, is very, very different because if clinical recovery, which can often be conceptualized as cure, can often be about sort of passive adjustment, then recovery and personal recovery can be seen as active engagement, ownership and acceptance. As the activist Ron Coleman says, if cure is something that's done to you, then recovery is something that you do for yourself. And in turn, in personal recovery, symptom cessation, getting rid of clinical signs, is not seen as the only or most important index of success. I, for example, still hear voices every day. But the difference is that now I can honestly stand in front of you and all the people who will see this on the internet and say, I am proud to be a voice hearer because I've reclaimed my experience. I am somebody who wanted to die rather than live with their voices and whose voices are now an important and valued and intrinsic part of their identity. And this is why I believe very strongly an aspect of recovery is the transformative process of being able to make sense of one's experiences in one's own terms, whatever that might be. And this is not a goal or an endpoint, but an ongoing journey of discovery and growth. So to give an example from the research literature is this excellent synthesis of 97 articles summarising personal recovery that goes considerably beyond symptom cessation to incorporate factors like supportive relationships in personal recovery, optimism, the hope, the opportunity for moving towards a positive future, that mental health problems, of course, can be catastrophic and life-changing, but don't need to be the end of a meaningful life. A positive sense of self, meaningful life, something to recover for, and also devising a personally coherent account of one's experiences, and agency empowerment, self-responsibility, active coping, not just passive adjustment. And in turn, I think something else that's very important that comes out of research like this is the importance of subjective experience, not just society or psychiatry's expectations. And in this respect, a really valuable part of recovery that can often be minimized and overlooked is simply restoring your capacity to feel joy. Again, to move beyond surviving the past, to be able to turn your attention from the tasks of recovery and just focus on the tasks of everyday life, to live well. And this is one example of this sort of concept that I really like, because again, I think it's going beyond just the notion of the idea of getting rid of symptoms. I think you can experience all of these things and to thrive while still experiencing intense or demoralizing states. It's part of human difference and human diversity. The difference between feeling damaged to being able to name what has happened, to be able to say, I was wounded, now I'm healing. Being overwhelmed by the past, grieving for the past, ultimately to be able to live in the present. Not hiding from feelings, but being able to stay with emotional pain and ultimately understand that that pain will pass and bring new insights. Rather than placing our own needs last, to be able to learn healthy needs and to be able to prioritize ourselves as the best way to function and help others. Rather than being serious all the time, moving from beginning to laugh again and ultimately to seeing the humor in life. Idealizing others as better and stronger, to be able to hearing others' stories, to be able to live with compassion and openness for self and others. Rather than feeling selfish and undeserving, we can learn to see that seeking help is a brave commitment to healing and ultimately feel proud of our healthy, caring selves. Moving from shame and unworthiness to experiencing peace and optimism, knowing that recovery is possible, and ultimately to feel authentic, connected, and whole. Now, of course, this isn't meant to dictate anyone's route for a recovery journey. It's just an example. And I certainly don't know anyone who ticks all these boxes. I absolutely don't. I think anyone who did would be utterly unbearable. Can you imagine how sort of actualized and authentic they would be? But again, it's a sort of a different take on what well-being and what thriving might mean for some people. And again, extending our lens and our gaze beyond this rigid notion of clinical cure. And of course, that said, it's also very, very important to emphasize that recovery should never be used in a punitive or judgmental way. We absolutely have to recognize the complex factors like poverty, stigma, exclusion, helplessness that can really seriously impede and hinder a person's journey to healing. We absolutely need to recognise these things, that recovery doesn't get turned into another stick to beat people with. We need a constant profusion of support, compassion, and emotional and material resources for those that need them. But we also always need to have hope. As Professor Stephen Hawkins says, there should be no boundaries to human endeavour. We are all different. However bad life may seem, there is always something you can do and succeed at. While there's life, there is hope. And in that, I absolutely include myself, because looking back at the wreckage and despair of those years, it absolutely seems to me now as if someone died in that place, and yet someone else was saved. A broken and haunted person began that journey, but the person who emerged was a survivor and would ultimately grow into the person I was destined to be. Now, many people have harmed me in my life, and I remember them all, but the memories grow pale and faint in comparison to the people who've helped me. The fellow survivors, the fellow voice hearers, the comrades and the collaborators. The mother who never gave up on me, who believed that one day I would come back to her and was willing to wait for me for as long as it took. The doctor who only worked with me for a brief time, but who reiterated his belief that recovery was not only possible, but inevitable. And during a period of devastating relapse, told my terrified family, please don't give up hope. I believe that Eleanor can get through this. Sometimes, it snows as late as May, but summer always comes eventually. This talk would absolutely not be enough time to fully credit those good and generous people who fought with me and for me, and who waited to welcome me back from that agonized, lonely place. But together, they formed a blend of courage, creativity, integrity, and an unshakable belief that my shattered self could become healed and whole. I used to say that these people saved me, but what I now know is they did something even more important, in that they empowered me to save myself. And that's a message that I would absolutely emphasize for anyone who's sitting in this audience as a supporter of someone who experiences extreme and profound distress, is believe that one day that person could be stood on a stage like this, identifying you as that one person who absolutely made the difference for them. Because as Peter Levine has said, the human animal is a unique being endowed with an instinctual capacity to heal and the intellectual spirit to harness that innate capacity. For friends, for family members, for members of society, there is no greater honour or privilege than in facilitating that process of healing for someone. To bear witness, to reach out a hand, to share the burden of someone's suffering, and to hold the hope for their recovery. And likewise, for survivors of distress and adversity, it's extremely important that we remember we do not have to live our lives forever defined by the damaging things that have happened to us. We are all unique, we are all irreplaceable, and what lies within us can never be truly colonised, contorted, or taken away. The light never goes out. Or as a very wonderful doctor once said to me, "Don't tell me what other people have told you about yourself, Eleanor. Tell me about you." Now, in this respect, I want to conclude this presentation with a brief reading from my own memoir of madness, available to buy on Amazon, that learning from the voices in my head, that I think for me brings together some of the themes of this evening, of an event like tonight's. The importance of hope, the importance of story, the importance of solidarity, and the importance of good people coming together and joining together to really try and make a difference. Psychiatric services are not responsible for the factors that drive people mad, but what they can do, what they are morally obliged to do, is address the repercussions in more constructive and restorative ways. Furthermore, the focus of this help should not only be healing individual hurts, but actively supporting the person to reconnect with their community, restoring or creating social bonds of fellowship and solidarity. The essence of madness is isolation. You have to go there, and you have to go alone. Similarly, the main crucibles for madness, experiences like loss, trauma, or injustice, are enacted on a silent, shameful, lonely stage. Recovery is the opposite. It's about reconnection and emancipation. It's reclaiming the desolation, ugliness, and terror, and realizing that it no longer possesses you, because finally, you're in possession of yourself. In the immediate aftermath of my madness, I briefly resolved never to speak about it again. The sum of events, I believed, added up to a debasement and corruption of what my life ought to have been. Not something to be commemorated, but something to be endured, outlasted, and forgotten. I would study psychology, possibly work in mental health, and the sordid, stigmatized reasons for the choice would never be broadcast. But gradually, I changed my mind. I rebelled against the notion that I was totally and irreparably broken, resolving instead to begin sharing and celebrating those damaged parts of myself. And while that pursuit has often been difficult, I have never regretted the decision. The renowned trauma theorist Judith Herman describes the concept of the survivor mission, in which the meaning of one's victimization is transformed and transcended by making it the basis for social action. By engaging in my own survivor mission, I vowed to take all the horror and heartbreak and fashion it into something that could be a gift for others, a possible source of comfort or guidance, and an attempt to speak out about the unspeakable. I could not undo my past, but I could own it, and in doing so, use it as a force for positive change. In the long term, this proved to be one of the kindest things I could have done for myself, because it was the means of receiving so many gifts in return from the people I meet in my work, whether fellow survivors, family members, or the innumerable mental health workers and academics, heroic and dedicated, who share my passion for social and psychiatric change. Just as they find my story healing, they are a source of endless comfort and consolation for me. I am constantly energized and enhanced by each encounter, by the constructions we share, the insights and wisdoms we impart to one another, and the sense that we are learning not only how to understand and interpret the world, but also how to change it. On a more personal level, the fact that every time someone is generous enough to confide that they have felt moved, encouraged, or inspired by my story, it reinforces that the legacy of what happened to me did not begin and end with suffering, sadness, and senseless loss. The best of me connects with the best of them. In turn, their endless awareness and enthusiasm, whether for their own personal journeys or with wider political and social concerns, remind me that progress is possible, is already happening, and that good people are standing side by side to proclaim, we will not tolerate this. Like May Sarton's poem Night Watch, we are crazy human with hope. But aren't you bitter, people sometimes ask me? Don't you just want to leave it all behind you? Or alternatively, but there are so many barriers to change. Aren't you tired of fighting? No, never. Because even in the midst of the darkest days, the kindness and decency I've encountered fortify, strengthen, and sustain me. It shows me that for every denier, abuser, and bystander, there are many more people prepared to take a stand against oppression and injustice. It enables me to meet people with the most astounding resilience who, having just survived heartless and horrifying cruelty at the hands of other human beings, still brim with hope, humour, and humanity. The knowledge that the human spirit can not only endure, but can prevail and thrive is a gift to the world. And over time, it's this knowledge that has helped me embody and identify so strongly with the sentiments of Ernest Hemingway, that the world is a fine place and worth fighting for. Thank you very much.